You're listening to MJCF Presents Abolish, a conversational series uncovering truths from the family regulation system, aka Child Protective Services. My name is MJ. Let's jump right in. Welcome. Hi, my name is MJ. Welcome to this amazing episode of MJCF Abolish, where we will be talking about ICWA court and ICWA in general. ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act. So my apologies for everyone that is not familiar with that term within the family regulation system. Today we have two special guests that is going to join us that are specialists in ICWA court, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Alyssa, Willie. I'm from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm also Seminole Tribe of Florida. Grew up on the Bright Seminole Reservation in Okeechobee, Florida, and I've been living in Denver for about 5 years now. I also have my MSW from the University of Denver, and I also have a Master's of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma.
Boom. We can do mic drop just on that intro.
Mic drop.
And then we also have another special guest.
I'm Correll, and I am from the Ogallala Lakota Nation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I am a parent advocate at ORPC and the director of community support for parent survivors at the coalition.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome. The reason why I wanted to have this conversation is to get ready for Indigenous Peoples Day. It used to be Columbus Day, but now we have evolved and now we are educated enough to never say Columbus Day again, but Indigenous People Day. But essentially what we wanted to do is have a special about ICWA and what that looks like. Alyssa, can you tell us a little bit about what is ICWA and why is that important in relation to the child welfare system?
Yeah, so the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 is a federal law that involves Native children and tribes to keep Native children to stay in their tribes with their families and not be adopted out from their tribes. So what ICWA is kind of like a guide on with tribal courts if a child is involved in a child welfare case. And so when that determination is established with if the child is a tribe or enrolled or eligible to be enrolled into a tribe, there are certain things that courts have to look into, have to make sure that all these provisions are made before the child is placed into foster outside of the tribal community, tribal governments.
No, that makes sense. So essentially it is a standard of practice in which if a child that is of Native American descent or is eligible to be enrolled in a tribe, by the way, shout out to Muskogee Creek Nation, I appreciate those checks. That is the tribe that I'm registered with from Oklahoma, so I always like to thank them. And essentially it is this bare minimum of rules and regulations, so therefore you have to put that into practice whenever a child is involved in the family regulation system and or dependency neglect cases, CPS, child welfare. So for there to be an act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that makes me think that there was probably a lot of Native American children that were adopted at some point and an act had to be put in place in order to try to slow that down. Is that correct?
Yes. So, from a historical standpoint, one of the things that had started in an assimilation to assimilate in Native people into being more westernized, kind of the ways that the U.S. government could deal with the Native problem was to assimilate Native people, and the one way to do that was to do that with the children. So I can't remember the year. It's 18. Well, I'm thinking about is the boarding school era. It started with the boarding school era, and that was the era when a man by the name of General Platt kind of started the first boarding school at Carlisle in Pennsylvania, where he was a captain in the military, and so he had Native captives that he had in military in forts and things, and he kind of made this discovery that if we put them in regular clothing and we can educate them, that would potentially just like
make them into like a secondhand white
yes, exactly. And so he's the one that's credited with saying, kill the Indian, save the man. And so
kill the Indian, save the child, or save the man.
Yeah. And so with that, he kind of put that philosophy into his boarding school, and that's when that era began with taking children from their communities and placing them into a boarding school where they stayed for a long period of time. Sometimes that they could go back if they were closer or had money to go back home in the summers, but most of the time it was they stayed there until they graduated.
Oh my gosh.
And
would this be from like elementary to like what we consider elementary age all the way up until like seniors, or was this like 2 years? Was this like a white supremacy summer camp for a couple of years, or what are we talking?
I think it depended on just the organizations that were doing this. So, I mean, that's kind of he's kind of one credited with like the first, idea of doing this. And then you also have, more Catholic churches, and there's like boarding schools are popping up all over the states. In this assimilation era, they also allowed for churches. The United States government allowed for churches to do those, to make schools, to send children there. And it was so that's interesting that the United States government worked with religious organizations to do this as well. And so you've got a period of years and years of children being taken from their homes and their families and placed in boarding schools. There's several generations of that happening with families. And so that's like one piece of it. Wow. And then you still have, and then between that time, there's been several like changes within the government. Especially when it comes to like the rights of Native people. So right now we're kind of in this era where we have our tribal sovereignty, but also we're looking back on, there was, it took like from the 1930s. So actually in the 1930s, 1934, I believe, I'm not remembering that, but that's when they kind of looked into going back and giving tribes their sovereignty and letting them reestablish their governments, and as to about where they are today. And that was based on, because of reports from a report called the Merriman Report that looked at the conditions that the natives were living in at the time. So because of that assimilation, that's after the era of allotment, general allotment, things like that. A lot of tribes were very poor, they had poor health. The schooling that the children were receiving at boarding school was not adequate. There was a lot of those things, and so that kind of alerted policymakers and things in the 30s to, hey, this is not a good thing that they're doing for Native people. And so like that's kind of where there's a sense of change and in the 1930s that this happened. Indian Reorganization Act is what that's called. And then after that, in the 50s, it kind of did a bit of a revert policy action happened. That is called what era is that called? I'll think of it in a minute, but termination era. So termination era was when they were trying to terminate, the United States government was trying to terminate tribe status. And then this is also when they were encouraging, again, assimilation tactics.
Okay, so they were trying to terminate the tribal's
status.
So kind of like going back on their...
It would be revoking their federal status of them being a tribe. So several tribes...
breaking their promises again.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
And so some tribes did get terminated. I think specifically, it was like the Klamath, the Menominee, were a couple that had their tribes terminated back then.
I did not
know
that. Did you know that?
No.
Oh my gosh.
And so in that 1950s era, you also have the Relocation Act, I believe, and that's like the assimilation process again in the 50s of, hey, we're going to have these cities that are established as relocation cities that for natives to come to off the reservation to come, they would have job opportunities, housing opportunities, things like that. And that's well, Denver is actually a relocation state. And so they came over here with kind of that idea that they were going to, be able to get jobs, have housing, these kind of things. And then that didn't turn out to be.
Were these 100%. Relocation states or cities?
Cities.
Really?
So Denver, I believe LA, Chicago, some of the bigger cities that are, yeah. And so that was, again, trying to assimilate natives from the reservation to live off the reservation and
kind of like integrate it again.
Yes.
Oh.
And then when we move into the 60s, there's what's called the late 50s and 60s, the 60s swoop, where they were taking children from native families and placing them to be adopted by white families.
And this is only in the 60s?
Yes.
So this is like our parents' age.
Mm-hmm.
Children being stolen.
Yeah.
Human trafficking.
So this was happening, and it was, of course, that idea of that assimilation, like where they need to assimilate into mainstream culture. If they do that, then we can, if they're not being in their tribes anymore, they don't need to be tribes anymore, and we can revoke that status. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. But also in that process, you still have that assimilation tactics of taking children, placing them in other homes.
Absolutely.
And so that's what kind of led up to all these stories that people are starting to talk about, like their children are being taken and like right from when they had them at the hospitals, and sometimes there's stories of that, or
I'm petrified right now. I mean, I'm mortified. I'm mortified because this is the most history I have ever learned when it comes to like what the legality around ICWA looked like. Like there's so much history behind it before we even got there. I'm only very familiar with the little bit I know about, ICWA. So for you to have, I'm grateful for you to share your knowledge with us, because this is, for it to be happening in the 60s. I mean, we know it's happening now, but for it to just be as rampant in the 60s, to be called like a swoop, right? Like this is what the goal is.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that, like, those were happening, and then people started like seeing that, there's still boarding schools happening at this time. Children are still being placed into boarding schools or adopted out into white families, and all under that guise of assimilating, becoming in that mainstream culture. And so in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, you see a rise in AIM, you see a rise in the civil rights movement. That's when
American Indian Movement, AIM.
Yeah. And the thank you. And the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed in I believe it was the 70s as well. And so you have those things happening in the big main scope of things. Yeah. And then that's when they start that talk about, like, well, what about our children? How do we keep our children with the tribes? Because there's a lot of them that are being adopted out.
Yes. And
not knowing their culture, not knowing their family, not knowing, all these things. There was no say, like the tribe had no say in this, the families had no say in this just happened. And so that's kind of where that start of ICWA happened. The beginnings of that is to kind of help that from happening.
At least slow it down.
Yeah. And so in 1978, that's when ICWA was passed, and that's what we use today, even when we're working with our cases and or just
yeah. So will you talk a little bit about how we met? Is that I was a social worker working with a parent that was registered with a tribe, and you were an in-home service provider, an amazing in-home service provider, which is how we're still friends and colleagues to this day. But will you talk a little bit about the organization that you work with that's here, that I've had lots of experience with? It's one of the only organizations that give family services to Native Americans. Will you tell us about DIFRAC, what DIFRAC is, and how you are related to DIFRAC?
Yeah, so DIFRAC is the Denver Indian Family Resource Center, and I'm a family engagement specialist there. So my main duties are to work with families that are in the child welfare system, Native families, and I provide case management, life skills. I teach a parenting class, and just overall just helping connect families with the resources that they need while they're involved with this system. And so those are kind of the things that I do. Overall, our organization also, we help the community providing other resources, and, if someone is to come in, we are offering like some housing assistance right now, food assistance, just basically just kind of anything.
You're just this all community resource center.
Yeah.
By the way, shout out to your new ED.
Yeah.
She's amazing. She's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, she is. Tara Matthews is our
Shout
new
out to Tara.
ED. She's been there a year, last September, so we've had a lot of good things changing, and
Because change is good.
Yes.
yeah. And so it's also, she's very supportive in the work that we do, and very supportive of wanting to be with community and really reaching what our community needs are.
Absolutely.
So we're really, right now, I believe we're kind of still in a transitioning stage. We're looking out like what we can do better for Native families. I know a majority of our work now is mostly like, what is the intervention? So my work is more intervention. So as clients come in, we're, they're
Are
helping.
they usually court order?
Well, we do get referrals from counties, or they can come in voluntarily and have services too.
Which counties do you get like most of your clients from?
So right now we mostly work in Denver and Adams. Denver and Adams counties both have ICWA courts.
Oh, okay.
And so we have...
Are they the only counties that have ICWA court?
In the state of Colorado.
Yeah.
And there's I'm not sure on the number now, there's about 10, I think, ICWA courts across the state, or across the United States. And so Colorado actually has 2, so that's kind of unique situation.
I did not know that.
I'm not sure on the number now. It was something like 10. It might have
I'm going
went
to
up.
look it up, because that is so concerning to have. We know that marginalized communities are the ones that are captured within the family regulation system. And we know that Native Americans, and we've had this discussion about Native Americans being invisible, right? So everyone is able to claim, but Native Americans are invisible. We talk a lot about how, and then we'll probably have this conversation with our debrief about Native American women are the ones that have the highest number of missing women in our entire nation. And no one talks about it, right? And this is on the reservation and off the reservation. And somehow it gets no playtime. It gets no information about it. So it's concerning to have a large percentage of Native American children, this invisible population in the States, on their land, on our land, our ancestors' land, to not get credit enough to have educated court systems to support them and to continue to help this community heal through justice and equality. So it just really triggered me when you said we only have 2 in Colorado. So yeah, I just had to talk about that piece, because that's really concerning.
Also, we're very much overrepresented in the child welfare system.
Yeah, you said that we were overrepresented. Native Americans are overrepresented in the child welfare system. So Katie, I wanna turn to you. I want to talk about what is your relationship to ICWA court?
Well, I had a dependency and neglect case of my own, and I live in Adams County, and so my case should have gone to ICWA court.
You are registered.
Yes.
With the
tribe did not respond.
Okay.
And I made the decision that I was not going to reach out to the tribe and ask them to respond. For one, because one of my aunts works in our tribe's ICWA office. And at the time, my cousin was the president of our tribe, and I felt immense shame being involved in a dependency and neglect case.
Yeah.
And so it was something that I didn't want my family or anybody from my tribe to know about.
It makes sense. I never thought about it.
It was
on that aspect.
Very shameful for me.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go home and have everybody know that I had gone through this. And so I made the decision that, my attorney kept saying, we need the tribe to respond, we need the tribe. And I kept saying, okay, I'm on it. But I wasn't. I did what I needed to do
to get this case closed.
To get the case closed as quickly as I could, and it was. And I closed my case in 8 months.
Which is almost unheard of. I think it is unheard of.
I did everything they wanted.
Above and beyond. 5
days a week for many, many months because of a glitch in the system.
The entire system is a glitch.
But it was, I had to beg for permission to have my kids at the sweat lodge with me. I had to beg a room full of white women to allow my children and I to go to sundowns that year and be able to pray. And Christian, my oldest, actually wanted to pierce. That was going to be his first year piercing. And I had to tell him that because we were involved with the department and they were watching us, that he could not, because I was afraid that if they found out, I would be charged with child abuse.
Just for practicing your cultural beliefs.
Yes.
Your spiritual beliefs.
Yeah, I was afraid. I was afraid that I would get in legal trouble if I allowed my son to pierce while we were under this magnifying glass and control that is the child welfare system.
Wow. I didn't even think about that aspect of not being able to participate in your spiritual foundational support and also have a piece of that taken away from you. I cannot imagine. I am so sorry. I can't even imagine. And now you are in this position where you are a professional.
Yeah.
And you actually work specifically in ICWA court as well. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's in Adams County.
Yeah. So ORPC knows that I want to take any ICWA case that an attorney needs help with. Helping other Natives is my passion. I want to see them succeed. Mm-hmm. I want to see the intergenerational trauma end, and I want to be a part of that. And so Alyssa made a great point because Jefferson County does not have ICWA court. It's the same judge who's presiding over every other child welfare case. And so there are things happening that I think they're just kind of winging it as they go because they're not knowledgeable. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous.
I honestly think even people within the ICWA court community, even though they work within it, are not knowledgeable of ICWA court, unfortunately. So just that title, right, of just saying I work within ICWA court doesn't necessarily mean that you're educated with ICWA or culturally respectful to the communities that you are there to serve, whether it's Jefferson County, Adams, Arapahoe, Denver, and so forth. So for you, what have you seen as a professional now on the other side as a professional in ICWA court? What have you seen that may negatively impact parents and are maybe a barrier of them being successful?
I think that a huge part is the tribe getting involved, because a lot of times they don't respond, or it takes months and months and months for them to respond. And then I think that Denver County is very, very open to, my request for my ICWA clients that they are receiving services from Native American organizations. One of my very first cases was an ICWA case, and that was how I was first introduced to Alyssa. And so since then, I am very insistent that my clients are being referred to organizations that are tailored to our own community.
Yeah, Absolutely.
And to get those services, I do see that some counties are not okay with it and they don't want to put that referral in. They want to send them to a provider that they're comfortable with and that they use all the time. And that's great. It might be fine for someone, a white person, but it's not necessarily appropriate for people with our cultural beliefs, the trauma and
the generational trauma that has been passed down, historical generational trauma.
Yes, for years and years and years. I mean, I recently talked to you about Emiliano wanting to cut his hair to look like a boy. And, having to have that discussion of how lucky he is to be able to wear his braids proudly. And not have anybody tell him that he has to cut them.
Or do it for him.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth. I think that there's not enough knowledge within the court system or the Department of Human Services. I think that they are not as aware as they should be or knowledgeable to the needs of our community. And so I think that ICWA is a bare minimum.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times it really doesn't even make much of a difference.
Oh, that's so heartbreaking. That is so heartbreaking. So ICWA, in my opinion, is always on the chopping block. They are always trying to find a way to take the little bit that we have away. What are the discussions around ICWA and them removing that from child welfare?
Yeah, so a little bit on that is, I wanted to I think this kind of ties into it as well, is how, that lack of understanding or that lack of knowledge of ICWA, even with other providers we've seen, I've sat in meetings or conversations and somebody's like, well, why do they get better treatment? Why do the Native people why do they have ICWA's the better treatment for them? And all of this, all they're saying is like, well, we're getting doing active efforts for one is, getting a mother, if she has problems getting to her UAs, providing them with transportation or providing with this. And that's part of the ICWA standard is you have to have active efforts and all active efforts made in order to say that child can't come back home.
Yeah.
And so I've had providers even say things like, why do they get better treatment? And it's that lack of understanding of exactly what that law is, what the guidelines and regulations are, what those things mean. And so I think that leads into all these misconceptions of why ICWA gets attacked and then kind of like where things are going with it being challenged. It's recently been being challenged, going to the Supreme Court, I believe, in trying to say ICWA is a racially based law, which it can't be a racially based law because as Native people enrolled into tribal governments under another tribal sovereign, we are a political entity and not a racial one. And so they use that as that way, like, why can't we adopt these Native children because there's this law that is biased because we're basing it on race when actually it's based on political affiliation with the tribal sovereignty. And so there's a lot of things that are talked about of what's going on with that, who's behind these things, and it's in relation probably to money and access and resources and dispossessions of land. So
that is, and it's always on the chopping block. It's like, here's the thing, white America, you have absolutely everything. Why do you need our babies? I mean, seriously, that's what why do you need our babies? Why do you continue to perpetuate the idea that you're the savior when you're the one that perpetuated generational trauma? I am so disgusted with people's willful ignorance And that is something that we are going to change with this coalition, which is educating people actively and aggressively. So I thank you both. I thank you both for being here, for being present. I am ecstatic about our debrief, where we will invite the community in on this conversation. I think it is a very robust conversation that we can continue to have around ICWA and the importance of ICWA, and actually putting judges that are maybe, I don't know, from the tribe, maybe that are Native American, to actually be over ICWA court. I think we need to have that conversation. So thank you again for being present. I'm very grateful. And shout out to DIFRAC. They do amazing work here in Colorado. We will absolutely be able to put their website and their resources on our Facebook page as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget to tune in next week for our live debrief with our special guest.